They were clad in green in spring and summer, and the sound of their singing could be heard even across the waters of Gelion, wherefore the Noldor named that country Lindon, the land of music, and the mountains beyond they named arid Lindon, for they first saw them from Ossiriand. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are taking a look at the elven realm of Ossiriand, better known as Lindon, and its history. This land is quite the reminder of the Elder Days, and has some amazing elves who lived there, so I'm quite excited to talk about it. Related articles and videos are in the description and cards for more info. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Originally, the land of Lindon was larger and encompassed a portion of East Beleriand. This land, called Ossiriand by the elves who first lived there, was originally settled in the later years of the trees sometime after the awakening of the elves by Teleri elves, who became known as the Lyaquendi, the Green Elves. Ossiriand, which was Sindarin for Land of the Seven Rivers, was a wooded region with many elm trees, and it was green from the easternmost river of Gelion to the arid Lindon, the mountains in the east. There was also a population of Ents, and due to how Treebeard describes Fangorn in the Elder Days and speaks about Beleriand, I wonder if the forests and Ents of Ossiriand were connected to those of Fangorn at all. While the elves of Ossiriand had a king named Denethor, they all maintained close ties to the elven king Ilu-Thingol, who was the lord of Beleriand and the king of the Teleri elves. They came to these lands due to the peace of Ossiriand under the protection of Thingol, and indeed they would help King Thingol keep Beleriand safe, as in the first battle of Beleriand in 1497 of the Years of the Trees, the Green Elves came to the aid of the elves of Doriath to defeat the forces of Morgoth. But it cost King Denethor and many of his followers their lives, and many of them would not return to Ossiriand. Others would return and dwell there throughout the First Age, and while they would interact with the other elves, involving themselves in only a few conflicts, the Lyaquendi were actually quite reclusive and separated from many of the major events of the First Age. The Noldor, who came back to Middle-earth, named this land Lindon, meaning Land of Music in Quenya, for the sound of music and singing could be heard here. But during the Silmarillion and First Age at large, while the Seven Rivers yet remained in the world, Ossiriand was its more popular name. During the First Age, Ossiriand would remain mostly peaceful, and some notable characters would travel through and live in these lands. Finrod Felagund, who was friends with the dwarves of the northern Blue Mountains, was also friends with the Green Elves, and came into these lands from time to time. It was actually Finrod who first, of the elves of the west, encountered men in Middle-earth, and he met them in 310 in northern Ossiriand as he beheld a campfire, something which was unlike the Green Elves to make. The Green Elves were aware of the men and did not wish for them to disturb the peace of their land, and bade Finrod to command them to either go back or for the men to move on into western Beleriand. And they did the latter, coming to settle in lands allotted to them by King Thingol and other elves. The next two clans of men that would come to Beleriand would probably also cross through Ossiriand. The Green Elves cared deeply for maintaining the peace of their lands, and they actually helped the Sons of Feanor to the north keep the border against Morgoth's forces until it was broken in war. While many fled to Ossiriand, it remained actually quite safe throughout a majority of the age, as there was no great elven settlement there, and its people seemed to be quite nomadic and of little threat to Morgoth's overall ambitions in Middle-earth. After the quest for the Silmaril in 466 of the First Age, Beren and Luthien came into Ossiriand and lived in Dorfirn-y-Gwienar, the land of the dead that live upon the Isle of Tol Galen on the Ossiriand River of Adiront. Beren and Luthien were both friends of the Green Elves and had peace there, mostly, away from the troubles of Beleriand. Before the Silmaril came to Luthien, however, the dwarves of Nogrod betrayed and murdered King Thingol, her father, he whom the Green Elves bowed to. And so Beren, with the Green Elves and Ents of Ossiriand, avenged Thingol upon the dwarves in the Battle of Sarn-Athrad on the border of Ossiriand in 503, and much of the dwarven treasure was cast into the river Askar, and Beren took up the Nauglamir with the Silmaril in it, and gave it to his wife Luthien. While Ossiriand most certainly saw battle in the War of Wrath, as few places in Beleriand probably did not, it saw less hardship than many other lands, just as it had throughout its history. Thus, when Beleriand was destroyed and sank into the Sundering Sea, much of Ossiriand actually remained, becoming the new western coast of Middle-earth, although it had once been far inland. Since its rivers were not very apparent anymore, and many of the remaining Noldor in Middle-earth had moved there, including High King Gil-galad, it became better known as Lindon. As one of, if not the most western point in Middle-earth, closest to the ancient lands of Valinor, and it still retained some elven history, this became a great realm of elves in the Second Age, and it also became the greatest harbor for elves in Middle-earth, as Círdan the Shipwright, once the lord of the havens of the Falas, came to live there and build ships for elves to sail west from there. Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor, formed his realm and kingdom in Lindon, with Mithlond, the Grey Havens, being its capital in one of the Second Age. Lindon, split by the Gulf of Lune, had two main regions, Forlindon and Harlindon, west and slightly east of the Blue Mountains, and Harlindon was ruled for a time by Celeborn, husband of Galadriel, until they and some people moved to Evendim, and then on to Eregion. Indeed, it seems that the heavy presence of the Noldor, and perhaps even the new construction in Lindon, saw much of, but not all of the Teleri from Ossiriand and Doriath, many of whom had actually lived there originally, Loranond and Greenwood, east of the Misty Mountains, and joined the Sylvan Elves there. But High King Gil-galad, Elrond, Círdan, and likely Glorfindel for a time when he at last came to Middle-earth, lived in Lindon during the early to mid-Second Age, and they built one of the last great spanning elven realms in the later days of the world. There would be other ports in Lindon as well, such as Forlond and Harlond, and later in the Second Age, Gil-galad would also build the White Towers on the eastern border of Lindon, next to the border of Arnor in the north, for his friend Elendil. In 600 of the Second Age, Entuluce, a ship with the captain Viantor at its helm, came to Middle-earth from Númenor, and he arrived in Lindon, re-establishing contact between High Elves and the men of Númenor. Gil-galad would also befriend Aldarion, the Mariner, and other Númenorians, and call upon them in years hence for aid, as the Shadow crept back into Middle-earth. Lindon would deny entry to Anatar, Lord of Gifts, for Gil-galad and Elrond had doubts about him, and they sent messengers with warnings to Eregion, who made the mistake of letting him enter, and thus the War of the Elves and Sauron would come to pass, with Elrond leading forces from Lindon to aid the Elves of Eregion. During this war, Lindon was nearly conquered, as Sauron brought the war to its very borders in Eriador, only for the Númenorians to save Gil-galad's kingdom at last. After the destruction of Eregion, however, Lindon sadly saw much more traffic in the days of flight, as elves traveled to Lindon to leave Middle-earth forever upon the ships of Círdan and his builders, in greater numbers. While Gil-galad still held mastery over his realm until his death at the end of the Second Age during the War of the Last Alliance, gradual diminishment and dispersion of elves saw the realm of Lindon falter and diminish as well over time, and by the Third Age, Círdan the Shipwright remained as the Lord of the Havens. And Lindon and Rivendell held the most remaining Noldor in Middle-earth, but this population, again, diminished as the Third Age went on as well, for elves continued to leave this Middle-earth. Lindon would support Arnor even during the Northern Kingdom's decline in the Angmar War, as they provided elves during some of their fights with Angmar, and they even sent a ship to aid King Arvidwi, the last king, in the Bay of Forukel, which sorrowfully sank in the Ice Bay. But Círdan remembered his friendship with the men of Arnor. He remembered his King Gil-galad's friendship with the Númenorians, and he remembered even his King Thingol's kinship with Beren of Old. And so he joined his elves with those of Gondor and Rivendell, and marched to the Battle of Fornost to end Angmar once and for all. Besides Lindon's aid to Arnor, it perhaps retained the most important harbor in all of Middle-earth during the Third Age, and early Fourth Age, as it saw the arrival of the wizards in Middle-earth, wherefore Círdan gave his elven ring of power to Gandalf, and this harbor saw the safe passage of some of the last elves, ring-bearers and wizard from Middle-earth to Valinor. By the early Fourth Age, it remained one of the last great elven lands of old, with so much history that called back to the Elder Days. Due to this and its importance as a harbor of the West, it was also likely one of the last places abandoned by the elves in Middle-earth, as Círdan and Celeborn were said to have taken the last ship into the West sometime in the early Fourth Age. The Grey Havens, elven buildings of Mithlond, green pastures and forests, would remain in Middle-earth for many years after the elves who dwelt in them left. Yet perhaps the ages of music saw some measure of song remain in the land of music. And so we come to the end of our tale on the history of Lindon and Ossiriand. From Lindon, we see that lands and times of peace should never be underappreciated. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this region spotlight on Lindon. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on Lindon and Ossiriand? Let me know in the comments below. For me, I quite love the land in its former and latter ages, as it was a land of peace and nature and storied culture. Círdan is my second favorite elf in the Legendarium, I believe, right behind Finrod, so I really enjoy his realm and its place in the Third Age as well. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles through the link in the description below, or check out our merch or Patreon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons, Kyle Wetzel, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putin, and Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Merton, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Adam Petrlik, Brandon Glidden, Molly Sullivan, Daniel Burns, Anthony Harmon, Dorwin Gray, Arthur Merlin, and DJ Vaught. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members, it really means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on how I would do a series in the Second Age, based on the lore that I know, since the Rings of Power is just about to release. You all are the best, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.